All right, we are live, everybody. I am here with Alexander Mercouris in London and Gonzalo Lira in a location that we cannot disclose. No, I'm joking, Gonzalo. With Gonzalo Lira in the north of
in the Kharkov,
the northeast of Ukraine.
Yes.
Yes. So. We're losing your sound a little.
We're losing your sound,
Gonzalo.
Yeah. Am I good there? Sorry about that.
We can hear you now. Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you clearly.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry about that.
Now your sound is perfect. All right, so let's just get into it. We're going to have to do a hard stop, everybody, at around an hour and 45 minutes around there. So we'll do a hard stop. Any questions that are sent, we will do a dedicated show to answer all of the questions. If we have time to answer some questions towards the end of the show, we will definitely answer those questions as well. From Rumble, from Odyssey, from YouTube, and of course, the Duran.locals.com, our great locals community. So send us your questions. We will answer all of them either today or in another dedicated show that we'll be putting up on our channels. Gonzalo, real quick, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Gonzalo Lira 1968. That's my current Twitter handle. And you can also find me at Gonzalo Lira 2 on YouTube. Because I don't yet have access to my old accounts because the SBU changed my passwords. But as soon as I get that back online, it'll back to normal. But for now, on Twitter, Gonzalo Lira 1968. And right there, you'll find a link to my YouTube channel. So you should have no trouble finding me. Gonzalo Lira 1968.
And those are the only two official social media accounts for you, correct?
Yeah, the only thing that's official. Anything else except no substitute. Yes.
Okay, and I will pin those in the comments section when this live stream is over. So I will pin those channels up top in the comments so everybody can find them. So let's get going, everybody. Hello to our moderators as well. Real quick, a shout out to Zariel. I saw Zariel in here in the chat moderating, and I think Zariel, you are on your own for now, if I'm not mistaken. But I will be helping you out as well, Zariel. So thank you to our moderators and any of the moderators that are going to come into the show later on. Let's get started. Ukraine, Russia, and Poland. We had a very interesting op-ed, guys, from the Polish Prime Minister in the Telegraph, where he pretty much says that the collective West needs to eradicate the Ruski Mir, the Russian ideology. He calls it de-Putinification. De-Putinization. That's a direct quote, by the way. So anyway, Gonzalo, what do you think of this? Alexander, what do you think of this?
The cope is off the charts. That's what I think. I don't think anything else intelligent can be said about it. It's just an irrational hatred. And that irrational hatred has made Europe incredibly rash decisions that have driven its economy off a cliff. The European economy is crashing as we speak. Inflation, the price of gasoline, the price of heating oil, the price of food, everything. The European economy is crashing because these Euro fools, because that's what they are, thought that they could mess with Russia and that it wouldn't have any kind of impact on them because they stupidly bought their own propaganda and thought to themselves that Russia, it's a small economy, it's the size of Italy's, which is just an absurd kind of self-delusion. And so they imposed sanctions, and those sanctions have gone and hurt them badly. And now on top of that, they have the gall to say that Russia is weaponizing food. Because today Putin gave a speech where he talked about the wheat harvest, and he said it was one of the best ever. And it's on track to be one of the best ever, rather. And so all of a sudden the West is saying, well, you're weaponizing food. And it's like, you guys weaponize the entire financial system and openly try to break the Russian economy. And now you're upset that you might get consequences coming your way? Come on. How disingenuous can you get? Alexander, do you agree with this assessment or not?
Completely agree. Can I just say straight away that one of the most classic examples of, if you like, Western arrogance, vanity, conceit, call it whatever you like, is that Western leaders, to some extent, Western publics, you've got to be honest about this, have this view that they have a right to impose sanctions upon others, but there cannot ever be consequences for them.
Yes.
Others obviously must never impose sanctions upon them. If somebody dares do that, that's weaponization of whatever, food, oil, gas, what have you, or it's blackmail. I mean, sanctions are not blackmail when they're imposed by the West, but they are blackmail when they're imposed by someone else.
Yeah.
And of course, if somebody has the gall to take action to try to parry or mitigate the effects of sanctions upon themselves, then that is absolutely appalling. That's completely outrageous. And of course, if that's done in a way that also impacts on Western economies, that's doubly outrageous. And another example of weaponization. What is happening in the West, and we're only at the early stages, very early stages of this, is that Western governments back in February disregarded the advice of the Federal Reserve Board, of the financial community, of the oil and gas and energy industries. They imposed sanctions on Russia. They seized the assets of its central bank. They imposed sanctions on the central bank. They imposed they de-swifted several Russian banks. They orchestrated a withdrawal of Western companies from Russia, and they imagined that this tiny economy, as they believed it to be, this gas station masquerading as a country, would tumble and collapse like a house of cards. And to their, I think, horror, but it's a horror that they can't openly admit, none of the things that they expected have happened. Instead of the ruble crashing, and I can, it's still there on the White House website. You can see the anonymous official bragging after, they'd sanctioned the central bank, that the ruble will go into free fall. To their bafflement, the ruble has strengthened. The Russian economy has stabilized. There's signs of growth. I mean, obviously there's a recession, but there's signs of growth. As you say, the grain harvest is looking particularly strong. Oil production is increasing. Manufacturing is, going through a difficult period, but the indications are that will run its course by the autumn or late winter, and then will start to reverse its falls and start to grow again. Even the Economist admitted that everyday life in Russia continues normally. And this is something that they did not expect. And they did not expect that they would find themselves in an economic war of attrition, which, unlike the Russians, they are not prepared for. So their response is they're going to throw everything bar the kitchen sink at the problem, at the Russians, in other words. And then they look on baffled, firstly, as it doesn't work, and secondly, as it backfires on them. And this is the first time that Western publics have been directly affected by a sanctions war that the West has waged. The West has waged sanctions wars on many countries, on Iran, on Iraq, on Cuba, on lots and lots of different places. Yeah. And it's hardly caused a ripple. This sanctions war is exactly as you said, causing an enormous recession. And just before I finish, you mentioned the effect it's having on the European economy. Well, I got an email yesterday from somebody very close to me in Greece, and he tells me that his normal electricity bill up to now has been around 90 euros a month. It's just risen to 320.
Oh,
and he also tells me that the people in the organization he works for are in utter despair, and with food prices rising, because they're rising, with energy costs rising, Many of them are now facing a situation where they have no money to cover all their costs.
Yeah, the mentality. What I find so amusing is the mentality of like, we're going to impose sanctions, and oh my goodness, how on earth could you dare impose sanctions on us? That's blackmail. That's weaponization. I mean, in any other context, you'd think that it's cynicism, that they're just being cynical lowlifes. But the funny thing is that it's genuine. They're genuinely surprised. It's the attitude of children. By the way, is my sound okay?
Yep, absolutely. Okay. I can hear you clearly.
Okay, good. No, it's the attitude of spoiled children that, they kick you in the shins, and when you respond by kicking them in the shins, they're shocked, just like spoiled children. Anyway, look, I did a video that has gained some traction on my new channel, where I basically call it, and I say that by the end of the year, the Western economies are going to be crashing. It's going to be inflation. It's going to be a lack of food. And I think that is the key issue. There's going to be a lack of food, and we're already starting to see it. In the United States, there is an issue with baby formula that I find just shocking. Okay, but okay, there's that's starting to happen in the United States of all places.
Yeah.
But in Europe is a net importer of food. It is a net importer of energy. When you cut off, number one, a big customer for all your finished goods, but much more importantly, a big supplier of your energy and food needs. Where do you go? And look, all this nonsense talk about negotiating with Qatar to get more liquid natural gas and all this nonsense. It's very, very simple. The Europeans need more gas than anyone else on earth can provide. They need Russian gas one way or the other. They need Russian oil one way or the other. The thing is, see, with the oil, there are going to be ways, as you described them in a previous broadcast, Alexander, of basically manipulating paperwork and shipping routes so that Russian oil basically gets to Europe only with extreme markups, right? But at least they'll get the oil. With the natural gas, they're not going to get the natural gas. And the Ukrainians, a couple of days ago, out of the blue, for no reason whatsoever, announced that they were cutting off 1/3 of the gas supply to Europe through one of the pipelines. I forget the name of it at this point. I'm sure one of you guys can help me out here. The name of the pipeline, it doesn't really matter. The point is that this pipeline went through Lugansk, and neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians during this conflict have messed with the natural gas pipelines because, of course, both benefit. The Russians benefit by selling the gas. The Ukrainians benefit by skimming off some of the gas and collecting the transit fees. And so during this war, neither side has messed with those pipelines. But all of a sudden, 2 days ago, it started yesterday morning at 7 a.m. on May 11th. The Ukrainians cut off the gas supply, citing technical reasons that are just nonsense. There were no technical reasons whatsoever. And all of a sudden, Germany has 25% less natural gas than before. What do you think that that's going to have in terms of effect, the knock-on effect on German industry, let alone the issue of inflation of the euro in Germany? This is a catastrophe. And in Europe, they're taking it very la-di-da, no problem. And why exactly is Ukraine cutting them off? Because it wasn't the Russians. The Russians are happy to keep on supplying them. The Ukrainians were saying, oh, you have to change the gas pipeline. And Gazprom said, no, we can't change the gas pipeline because it's just technically not possible. It has to go through this pipeline. And I'm sure that that's the actual reason. The Ukrainians, for some reason, decided to do this. And by the way, I have no doubt in my mind that the Ukrainians would never have made such a decision unilaterally. They must have gotten the okay from the United States, possibly Britain as well, but certainly the United States. Victoria Nuland would never allow Zelensky to make such a decision all on his own. And so clearly, and I wanted to talk to you guys about this, clearly there was a political motivation, but for the life of me, I do not understand why they took this decision. Do you guys know?
No, I don't know, but I'm going to make a few guesses. One is that I think the Ukrainians and some other people are probably incredibly angry about the fact that gas for rubles, Putin's project, is now working. Now, we heard a few days ago the Russians say that 10 big European energy companies have opened corresponding ruble accounts at Gazprom Bank. And one of the big German companies actually came out openly and confirmed it. And then we heard yesterday that another 10 big European energy companies have now joined the first 10. So that brings it up to 20. And that another 14 are planning to do it. So, in other words, gas for rubles has won. And I think that's caused some people in Ukraine great anger. And it may not have been entirely unrelated to the fact that Annalena Baerbock, Germany's so-called foreign minister, has been in Kiev meeting with Zelensky and other officials. And it may also have been intended as some kind of a signal to the Germans that the Ukrainians are very, very angry that Europe has capitulated on gas for rubles, and as a result that they're restricting the energy flows. I agree, whatever the reasons behind it, and I don't think we yet know fully what the reasons were. The US was definitely involved, and I wonder, how long it will hold. But again, I go to the British media about all of this. It's not the Ukrainians who are interfering with the gas. It's the Russians. They're supposedly siphoning off gas.
What?
Why would the Russians siphon off gas to Europe? Are the Russians short of gas? The world's biggest producer of natural gas is suddenly run short of gas? I mean, it doesn't make any kind of sense. We get every kind of ludicrous explanation. No word about what the real reasons are. I'm sure there's going to be extremely angry telephone calls between various European companies and their governments. What those governments will be doing and what they'll be saying to Kiev is another matter again. But we have a situation in Europe, and can I just again briefly touch on the oil business? Because again, I have had some experience here. I mean, not with oil business, but with shipping. I've known some ship owners in my time, some Greek ship owners. I know how these things are done. I mean, I've not myself been directly involved in doing them, but I know people who have done them. It's incredibly simple. Greece has now clawed out an exemption from the oil embargo on Russian oil. Greek tankers are allowed to ship Russian oil around the world. Alex Christoforou explained in a other program that we did on the Duran that basically the Greek shipping industry, which is the major component of the Greek economy, depends on this kind of trade, and the Greek ship owners, who are an oligarchical power like no other in Greece, basically told the Prime Minister, the Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis, either you claw out this exemption or you're out. And the Greeks were joined in this by Malta and Cyprus, where obviously the same things also apply. So what's going to happen is that you're going to get Russian oil tankers, rather Greek oil tankers, and other oil tankers, Maltese, Cypriot, from all sorts of countries. They're going to be tanking up in Vladivostok or Murmansk or wherever on Russian oil. And then they're going to be sailing in a straight line to Europe. But before they get to Europe, we're going to have all kinds of fictional transactions taking place. Only they won't be exactly paper transactions.
Paper magic.
Absolutely. And let's not be sentimental about this. Let's not be naive. Money's going to pass. All sorts of people. It's going to be made, shall we say, attractive for them. All kinds of things are going to be agreed. And eventually that oil will arrive in Europe. Only by the time, of course, it arrives in Europe, it will have been comprehensively laundered. And of course, again, European energy companies will know where that oil is coming from. But they have their customer needs to meet, and they will look the other way. And so will Western governments and Western enforcement agencies. Every so often, some minor trader is going to be picked up and hauled in because he's involved in this kind of dealing. But the big fish will go on doing it. So more expensive oil, much more expensive oil for Europe, because they'll be paying a massive premium, because there'll be all these middlemen taking their cut. Russians will obviously get less of their oil than they would have done if they were able to sell it directly and straightforwardly to Europe. But in a situation where there's a commodity super cycle, which has been made worse by all these sanctions, they'll still be making an awful lot more than they were, say, a year ago. And the European consumer is going to be screwed. And a lot of people are going to become extremely, fabulously rich. That's what's going to happen. That's what the situation is setting up.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that the markup is going to be astronomical, and on top of that, I mean, the global the benchmark prices are going to be sky high. If you tell me that in, I don't know, 6 months' time we're talking $200 a barrel, I would not be surprised at all.
No, I would not.
And on top of that, they're going to slap on, because of all this legal magic that they'll have to put in order to launder the oil from Murmansk to Bremen. They're going to have to, mark it up 20% without breaking a sweat. And so the only people who are going to pay for this are European consumers.
Yeah.
They will have to make the decision this coming winter whether they eat or they have heat.
Yeah.
That will be the choice that European consumers will have to make.
Yeah.
And on top of that, because of this conflict, the Ukrainian farmers are not planting seeds. And so their wheat harvest this year is going to be catastrophic.
Yeah.
And there are certain countries like Egypt in particular, that's the one I'm worried about, where they depend on Ukraine grain. It is their it is their lifeblood. It's their source of food. They have long-term contracts with Ukraine, which will not be fulfilled. And so what will happen with the Egyptian people? In 2011, all of the Arab Spring revolutions and whatnot happened because there was a minor dip in Eurasian grain production, in Russian and Ukraine grain production. This is going to be a big hit on the global wheat market. Come September, October, we're going to see riots in the Middle East and in Egypt like we've never seen before. And more to the point, we're going to see enormous waves of migrants going to Europe, where, so many of these people think that in Europe, it's the streets are paved in gold. And so they are going to risk crossing the Mediterranean. They are going to get to Germany like nothing before. I mean, it's going to make 2014 look like nothing. This is going to be a disaster for Europe.
Yeah.
And these people don't seem to understand it, and they have the mentality of children. And let's not even start talking about these moron Finns and these idiot Swedes who are saying, oh, it would be a great idea to end our 80 years of neutrality and join NATO so we can put nuclear weapons right in front of St. Petersburg. Fools! What is wrong with you?
I know. Let's come to that in a moment, because I do want to follow up with this economic thing, because you're absolutely correct. One does start to see in some places the first glimmers of reality starting to break through. So the one major place of reality is Hungary, and Orban apparently has now said to Ursula von der Leyen that the only kind of oil embargo that he's going to support is one which allows pipeline oil from Russia to continue as before. In other words, no restrictions on it. The only limits will be on that he's prepared to be happy with is oil that's shipped by tanker. In other words, by sea. Now, as I understand it,
that hurts the Germans or the French, basically.
Exactly. So that's what Orban is saying. By the way, I understand most of Russian oil to Europe. I don't think all of it by any means, but I believe that, a critical mass of it goes by pipeline, which is one reason why it's cheaper, by the way. But anyway, that's what Orban is saying. Whether the European Union will agree to that is another matter. And never underestimate the ability of these people to railroad this through. Yeah. But anyway, Orban is talking, rationally. You're getting a whole succession of German CEOs of big industrial companies and indeed small industrial. My dog wants to just go out. Can I just let him go a moment?
Sure. No, I look about the whole situation with Europe. It's falling apart. That seems increasingly clear. And so the issue becomes, who is going to put some sanity in place? I mean, that's the question.
Yeah.
Who is going to be the adult in the room? Because so far, all I see are children. And you're saying, Alexander, that some German businessmen are going to wake up.
No, well, I mean, that's it, because of course they're talking, they're all coming out, they're saying this is insane, this has got to stop, we've got to find a negotiated solution. That's what the CEO of Bosch said. They're all saying, this can't continue if we cut off from gas. And of course, you're absolutely right about the problems with gas. That's going to make our situation far worse. We're going to get to gas in a moment, because there are implications about this Ukrainian gas cutoff. So they're saying all of this. The political class in Germany, apart from the fringe, which basically means the AfD for this purpose, are not listening. They're not paying any attention. Mario Draghi in Italy, who is many things, corrupt, despicable, obnoxious, but he's no fool, and he can do all the maths. He apparently went to Washington and had a meeting with Biden and said, look, there has to be a negotiated solution to this. But, what influence he has, I really don't know. And I wouldn't expect there to be very much. But at least one gets the sense that he understands that we're driving ever faster off a cliff. The political class is completely oblivious to all of this. And now, can I just turn to the gas? Because you had mentioned Qatar. Robert Habeck, who was the German economics minister, went to Qatar. I think it was at the beginning of March. And he came away saying that he had a deal with Qatar. And I said he didn't have a deal with Qatar. I said that the Qataris said, we're absolutely willing to sell you liquefied natural gas if you want. Bring your companies, we'll talk about it. But Habeck told the German people that he'd agreed a deal with Qatar. Well, we now see that this deal isn't anywhere near complete. There's arguments about this. The Qataris apparently are not happy with some of Habeck's ideas, because Habeck wants to leave it open to go for his, windmills and his solar power and all of that. And I suspect eventually there will be a deal, but goodness knows how long that's going to take. I mean, it's nowhere near enough to make up for the lost gas from Russia. You need to replace pipeline gas fast if you're going to be cut off entirely from it. Liquefied natural gas can't substitute for pipeline gas. There isn't anywhere near enough of it at the moment. You'd have to divert the entire liquefied natural gas fleet to be providing Europe, and there isn't anywhere the machinery in Europe to process it. Yeah. What Habeck has actually been doing, because he wants to say to everybody that he's reduced German dependence on natural gas, Russian gas, by 3/4 by the end of the year. What he's actually been doing is he's been buying as much Russian gas as he can to fill the underground reserves in Germany. And of course, he's able to conceal the extent to which he's doing it, because he sees the Russian Gazprom subsidiary, which manages these reserves, these underground reserves. Well, he can't do it now because the Ukrainians are cutting off a sizable part of the gas supply. And at the same time, he's having to divert gas to Poland and other places, but Poland is the big one, to make up for the fact that the Poles are refusing to go along with gas for rubles. So he is running out of gas to achieve what he wanted to achieve. Even if he achieved it, it would only be a temporary solution. But at the moment, it's not looking as if he's even going to manage that. Mm-hmm.
No, I'm just laughing at all these, these like machinations, all this nonsense. Instead of just being straightforward about it and saying, "Look, we hate the Russians. Russians evil. Putin the devil. Blah blah. But we need the gas, and so we're just gonna have to bite the bullet." Just be a grown up about it.
Yeah.
And all of these efforts that are so pointless. I mean, just back of the envelope calculations leads you to conclude that there's no possibility of having Qatari natural gas replace Russian natural gas. Also, there's something else too. I certainly do not understand the ins and outs on a technical level, but I do understand that gas is not a fungible commodity. Oil is not a fungible commodity. There are different types of gas. There are different types of oil, of crude oil, that they are used for different purposes, and very specialized and very expensive and hard to install equipment is used to refine the different kinds of these natural resources. And so it's not like money, $100 here or $100 there. It's all the same. It's fungible. It's exactly the same. But oil and natural gas are not so fungible. But people act as if they are, and these leaders act as if they are. They don't seem to understand the technical limitations to this whole process, and they screw themselves up to knots instead of just having the humility to say, "Look, we screwed up. We made a horrible decision, and we'll just have to walk it back." But the thing is, see, their pride is going to be paid for by the people. It's like the Polish situation. The Poles refused to do the euros for rubles scheme. And so who pays for it? The Germans. The Germans are paying for Polish pride. It's absurd. And it's all based on ego, on pride, on arrogance, instead of facing facts. And like I said, the people who are going to pay for this are the general public. It's going to be the older people who are on fixed incomes, people who are on pensions. They are not going to be able to afford food. They are not going to be able to afford heating. And these are elderly people. Okay. So what are the European governments going to do? Print more money? Money printer go burr? And just hand out 1,000-euro bills to whoever comes asking? I mean, you have to be responsible and manage your economy responsibly. But they're obviously not.
Well, indeed. I mean, the pressure at the moment in Germany is to get interest rates raised. I mean, the Bundesbank has now come out and said that the ECB must raise interest rates. I don't know what interest rates can realistically do, given that you have a supply crisis. But the idea, obviously, is to try to reduce demand. In other words, what the Germans are saying is that you've got to organize a recession.
Basically.
I mean, that's the only real way that you can balance everything and bring things back to a manageable level. But of course, a recession might actually balance things, but it's critically difficult for people. And of course, if it is going to result in a surge of unemployment, a collapse in investment, all of those things, then of course, further down the road, welfare payments, very high in Germany, by the way, are not going to be sustainable either, because you need that growing economy to keep that going. Remember, Germany, productivity in Germany has been falling. I mean, I don't mean, it's absolutely falling, but the rate of productivity over a sort of long period has not been increasing as the, German population is natural growth has been below replacement levels. You can make that up to a certain extent with immigration, but we know that there's problems with that. We're not going to get into those problems at the moment. And anyway, it's not ultimately a substitute because those people have not been through the German education training systems and all of these things. So it's going to be a real problem. But that seems to be the only answer that anybody has at the moment, except, of course, Draghi telling Biden, we've got to look for a negotiated peace. Now, at some point, I presume the penny will drop. But coming back to what you were saying, Gonzalo, at the start of the program, I think that we are in the beginnings of a major economic recession in the West. And of course, the worry I have, and I think the worry everybody has, is that we have a huge burden of debt that's been allowed to build up over a long, long time. So if we start getting into a recession situation, if we start getting interest rates grow, then of course that recession could be grisly. I mean, it could be much worse than the recessions that we've experienced recently. And I think that is something that, again, hasn't been factored in. I mean, the Fed is still talking about a soft landing. But I read even in the Financial Times, which is, neocon central in Europe, in Britain, and doesn't really want any criticism of the Fed or anything like that. But even the Financial Times, I was reading a commentary there by Martin Wolf, one of its commentators, who said that it's going to be all but impossible to achieve a soft landing. So we're heading to a recession. We're heading into recession. It could be a grisly recession, and we're in the middle of, in the meantime, what the British euphemistically referred to as a cost of living crisis, the like of which we've never seen. I mean, it's off the scale, and the Democrats are going to pay, one hopes and presumes, a political price come the November midterms. But the problem is the political class is united behind these policies, and there doesn't seem to be anybody prepared at the moment to put the brake down.
Yeah, well, in terms of the economy is concerned, well, the markets are in a slow motion crash across the board. They've erased all gains for the year. They are negative territory for the year. Bitcoin and all the cryptocurrencies that were supposed to be the salvation, that's where you can store value and whatnot, they're all crashing. Bitcoin is, I think it's at $28,000. And the pegged currency, cryptocurrencies are also falling. It's a whole, it's a bloodbath. And so there does not seem to be any kind of safe haven for what's coming. The only safe haven is real estate and properties that, of course, companies like BlackRock and Bill Gates over the last few years have invested heavily in farmland and residential properties. And those are the only things, real property, real assets are the only ones that are going to come out relatively intact. Any kind of paper asset, bonds, you're going to get shellacked. And insofar as a precious metal certificate of deposits, if I were you, I would, if anybody's into that, you better be very careful, because any kind of certificate is only as good as the institution issuing it. And so if that institution goes belly up, that's it. Your certificate is worthless. You're going to be in line with all the other creditors. So there is no safe haven other than real estate, precious metal is where it's at. And the one country in the world that has estimated total assets, commodity assets of $75 trillion is Russia, the largest owner of commodities on the earth. And of course, they're going to be sitting pretty, but everybody else is going to take a beating like never before. Now, insofar as the American economy is going and the way things are going in the United States, well, these morons, again, I'm sorry, but that's the only word to describe these people. A couple of days ago, the Biden administration and their sclerotic and idiotic group said that they wanted $33 billion for Ukraine. And the warmonger said, no, let's make it an even 40. And they passed the even 40 billion. People don't seem to realize $40 billion is an extraordinary amount of money. Do you know that the yearly budget for the Russian military is $56 billion? Okay. I mean, we have to measure the size of this package. And of course, it's going to go to the arms manufacturing companies and to Ukrainian oligarchs. That's where the money's going. Where in the United States don't have baby formula. And they're giving all this money to Ukraine and the oligarchs there. I mean, like, what clown world? It's clown world.
It absolutely is. I mean, I have to say, this is The other thing that I find that absolutely takes my breath away about all of this is that this is a $40 billion on top of a 13, well, actually,
Yeah.
sorry, almost $14 billion, which has already been spent. I mean, it's all gone. I mean, $14 billion in what, 6 weeks? I mean, where did it all go? What did it achieve? I mean, where is all this money that all these great
Javelins.
weapons, the
Went to
javelins,
javelins.
which apparently were not working, the switchblades, which aren't working. I mean, it's just incredible to see how this thing is. The more money is spent, the less seems to be actually produced from it. But I mean, again,
Alexander, you know something? What I'm thinking, and I'm not saying this ironically, I'm saying it for real. But what if they had taken all that money and said, "Hey, Vladimir, if we give you 56 billion, will you pull back?" He probably would have taken the deal.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, as I said, it is clown world, as you absolutely rightly say. And unfortunately, what was that expression? Spend $1 billion here, spend $1 billion there. Now you're talking real money. I mean, this is only the start of this. I mean, Jacob Dreisen has said that he expects fully, before this whole thing goes through the Senate and all of this, that 40 billion will probably grow to 70 billion. That's 60 to 70 billion. That's his guesstimate. And then, of course, that will probably last a few months or weeks.
I mean,
and then we'll have another one.
You know what I think this situation is, and I'm being very serious here. Okay, I mean, no joke. All joking aside, and what I'm going to say might sound like a joke. It's not. It's very serious. Have you noticed people who are gamblers, who are afflicted with the malady of incontinent gambling? I myself don't have any kind of problem, but I've seen it in others. And it's a tragedy where these individuals.
A member of my family had it. I know all about it.
Yes, it's horrible. Okay, I personally, thank God, nobody in my immediate family or even close family or friends had this, but I've seen it in other situations, acquaintances, or people who I knew who knew people. Anyway, the point is that these gamblers, they start spending their money, and all of a sudden they lose and lose and lose, and all of a sudden they're like, screw it, we've already lost so much, let's just bet the ranch. It's sort of like when they realize that there's no solution, so you just might as well just sign the IOU for $1 million or $10 million. It doesn't matter anymore, because you've already lost. In your bones that you've lost. And so it's just almost going through the motions. You see what I'm saying?
I think you're entirely right. It is an addiction, and I think that you're absolute. I think you've got it, actually.
No, but it's more than that. It's throwing in the towel. It's knowing that there's no solution, so we might as well just throw the kitchen sink at this, and in the hopes that something, somehow, some magic will happen. Do you see what I'm saying?
I think you're absolutely right. It's you put more and more chips on the one number as the roulette wheel spins, and then as you lose all your chips, you then pile on an even bigger mountain on them, until, of course, you're left with absolutely nothing. By the way, the best writer on this is Dostoevsky, and he wrote a wonderful short story called The Gambler, and there's a brilliant opera by Prokofiev, by the way, on this very which took that story and showed it, and it is an absolute addiction. I think it's I don't think that is a metaphor, what you described, Gonzalo. I think that is an analysis of the actual situation. These people are gambling. They gambled with the sanctions that they piled on in February. They've gambled with the $14 billion of military aid they sent before, and now they're gambling even more. And they're going to go on gambling until they've sold absolutely everything out. And now I want to because I think we really need to touch on the military situation.
Yeah, but I just want to say one thing, guys. I agree with the gambling thing, but I also think that all of these guys, these politicians, the oligarchs, the puppeteers behind all of them, they're making a killing.
Oh, no.
I mean, they are making
yeah.
a lot of money,
Mhm.
and if I go off of what they did to Greece in
Yeah.
2010,
Yeah.
I think they're going to take all of this money
Yeah.
and they're going to buy up everything, all
Oh,
the apartments, all the land,
Yeah.
all the flats in Europe, everything. And we are seeing you're going to own nothing and be happy. Part two after the coup. Now we're seeing the second act, and that's what they're going to do to Europe. This is not what they're going to do to Eurasia or to Asia or to the countries that are out of the system, Latin America. But as far as Europe goes,
Yeah.
I think, personally speaking, for Greece, I think they're going to come to Greece and they're going to finish the job that they started in 2010, and they're going to buy every single bit of property, including full islands. Don't be surprised if Jake Sullivan doesn't own some island in Greece in 5 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's what I think we're gonna see happen. They're gonna own it all, because I saw what the Greeks went through, and they had to. Greeks used to have their home, they had their grandparents' home, maybe their parents had a home. In 2010, they had to sell, their home in the village or their dacha because they just couldn't survive anymore.
Yeah.
We're seeing the second act play out from the coup. And they're going to take all that money and they're going to buy everything up. Exactly what you said, Gonzalo. Who's going to buy the real estate and the commodities in Europe? The people that are approving this $40 billion deal right now.
And coming to that, actually, because it follows directly from what you've just said, Alex, because, again, I have connections in the real estate industry here in Britain. I mean, at the moment, prices right across the entire real estate world are surging. I mean, because as Gonzalo correctly said, in a time of high inflation, where do people put their money? What retains value? They put it in land, in property. But eventually, the price rises beyond the reach of most people. And at that point, you start to get contractions. The housing market contracts, let me finish, at middle and lower levels. But of course, if you're talking about islands, and if you're talking about the very high end, there is absolutely no upper limit there. I mean, I could say that. I mean, I know all about that. I've seen it. I've seen how it works. At the moment, as it happens, Alex, just for your information, there is an island in Greece which is for sale for €7.5 million. It's got a lot of things you need to do, but, it's on sale. I mean, I happen to know. Don't ask me how I happen to know, but I do know. 20 million euros, there'd be buyers.
Yeah.
If prices rise that in that kind of way.
Yeah, but here's the thing. See, I personally, of course, was a child, a small child, when it happened in Chile, that we had hyperinflation during the last year of the Allende regime in 1973. And what happens when inflation goes extremely high before it hits hyperinflationary realm? When things go really high in value, all of a sudden asset prices start to collapse. Because what happens is that people start to need cash in order to buy necessities. And that's what happened in Greece in 2010. That so many people all of a sudden found themselves that they didn't have any money, and so they wound up selling precious assets, their homes or their cars or whatever, because they needed the cash on hand to buy food to survive. And so what happens in a hyperinflation or a very high inflationary environment is something to be aware of, because what you're saying that the prices of properties right now are skyrocketing, and they're actually outpacing inflation by quite a bit, probably because people are parking their money into real estate, real assets.
Yes.
But what will happen is that when high inflation becomes normalized, when you have 20 to 30% annualized inflation and your food bill is far outpacing your earning ability, people will they'll start to sell their toys. I'm telling this for the audience so that you guys in the audience, in the chat, will understand what will happen. People start selling their toys, like their jet skis, their motorcycles, the third car that they have, Jeep that they have for the weekend and stuff like that. They're not going to sell their daily driver. They'll sell the extra that they have, whatever that extra is, and they'll sell it at a fairly steep discount. Right now, you're seeing that a lot of used cars are being sold at a premium because there are no new cars. But once you get into a hyperinflationary environment of 20, 30%, those prices are going to fall radically because there's going to be a lot of offer. And they're going to be like the nice cars, like the G-Wagon and stuff like that. They're going to start to sell at a big discount, at like a 30% discount. And as that gets flushed through the economy, more expensive and important assets will start to go on the market at even steeper discounts. And I can tell you a specific example that happened to an uncle of mine, the man who married my mother's sister. That when he was an architecture student in 1973, he had a little Fiat, a little MG that was just a POS, a student car, right? And he was offered an apartment for this car, an apartment, because what happened was that the family that owned the apartment knew that they could turn around the car and sell it and get ready cash to leave the country. But they couldn't find any buyer for their apartment. And it was a nice luxury apartment. And my uncle, and I know the story because my uncle to this day keeps on telling the story that I kept the stupid car. I should have given it for the apartment. It's one of those things that, the deal of a lifetime that slipped through his fingers, because he was a kid. He was 22. What did he know, right? But the point, and it's very important for you to understand, chat, that when high inflation gets to that level, 20, 30, 40% annualized, people will start to drop every asset they have to get cash to buy food. That's the thing. And that's the horrible situation that will happen. And you think that this can't happen, that the American economy, the European economy, that this is impossible. Anything can happen. I mean, honestly, can you remember back to October of 19 and how far we've come in 2.5 years?
I think that's an extremely good point. By the way, you're absolutely right about the effect of inflation. There's been ample academic studies about this. Both of you are right. The effect of inflation, the eventual effect of high inflation, is that it centralizes and concentrates wealth. The wealth becomes ever more concentrated as assets eventually slip into fewer and fewer hands. Now, as I said, there's enormous academic literature on this, of which I have only touched the surface myself. But, that is an iron rule of an inflationary crisis. It happened, by the way, in Germany in the 1920s, that one of the effects of the inflation in Germany was that German industries especially became much more concentrated than they'd been previously. And of course, if we're talking about Russia in the 90s, well, that's another story again. So that is the iron rule of an inflation crisis, that, as I said, assets begin to become concentrated in an ever-shrinking number of hands. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And I'm afraid the second thing I wanted to say, and this absolutely follows up from what Gonzalo just said, which is that it can happen anywhere. Nowhere is immune to an inflation crisis. It can happen in Britain, it can happen in America. The fact that it's not happened before doesn't mean that it can't happen. Now, what prevents it happening are two things. Firstly, the very fact that it hasn't happened before means that provides some kind of break, because people are accustomed to operating in a certain way. They have a confidence in the currency, maybe a misplaced confidence in the currency, but they believe that because the USD is worth something today, it will continue to be worth the same or something similar tomorrow. And that is an important factor, and we must never discount it. But ultimately, what makes the difference is sound economic management. Now, if economic management is unsound, if it is pursuing irrational objectives, which is what we're seeing at the moment in Europe and to a certain extent in the United States, then an inflation crisis becomes all too real, all too possible. And we are at the early stages of this one. Now, maybe things can be done. There's still time to turn things around. and maybe there will be a pushback eventually. And I'm beginning to sense, especially in Germany, that there is the first stirrings of protest against this rush. But the trouble is, the quality of our political class everywhere in the West is abysmally bad, and they're intoxicated with their own power and their own belief. And of course, they don't have any, as I've said many times, they don't have any internal brakes or reverse gears. I mean, if Ursula von der Leyen were listening to the experts, she wouldn't be pressing on with this oil embargo idea. It's clear nobody really wants it except her and her group, and people like Habeck and Baerbock and people like that. But nonetheless, because nobody's prepared to say no to these people, I suspect that sooner or later she will get him.
I actually, I'm not sure that she will. There's a weird arrogance to them that that prevents them from seeing, once they have made up their minds about something, it's a weird stubbornness, the stubbornness of truly stupid people, that they think that they're absolutely right, and so they will never deviate from their course of action, no matter how incredibly destructive, no matter how obviously destructive it is. They believe that they are the owners of the truth, and they're going to go to the end. And so and also the other issue that you point out, which is the thing that deeply troubles me and depresses me. You see, if we get rid of all of the leaders that we currently have on both sides of the Atlantic, the next crop up, they're going to be equally stupid, equally pig-headed, and they're not going to make the wise decisions. The wise decisions for the audience, if you want to know what it is, it's very simple. It's, first of all, tell Zelensky to negotiate a surrender. Because every day that passes, you are losing a battalion of men needlessly. You are losing 500 to 700 men per day in Ukraine in a war that cannot be won. It is simple as that. It cannot be won. There's no denying it or debating it. And finally, the Western media, Western commentators are starting to slowly admit the truth, which is that the Russians are winning. Slowly, inch by inch, they're grinding away, because these people don't have any understanding of what a war of attrition really is. And the Russians, of course, are past masters at it. It's just this slow, patient grinding, eking out, a kilometer or two a day of advance. And of course, in the West, accompanied, used to rather dramatic wins and victories and big sweeping movements. They don't understand this notion of, a kilometer or two a day, but, over 10 days, 20 days, it adds up. And so that's the Russian mode of war, and it's very effective, and they're winning. They should reach a ceasefire agreement and a peace agreement, and they should roll back these sanctions and try to go back to a status quo ante, because this is only going to hurt the Europeans. There is no solution where the Europeans, quote unquote, win. I mean, Alexander, do you see anything where you could say, oh, the Europeans won, the Americans won in this conflict, in this situation?
I can't see any way that Europe comes out well from this. I really can't. And you're absolutely right. The right thing to do, the correct thing to do if you care for Ukraine, is that you tell Zelensky, negotiate, find a compromise. But of course, we're not doing that. We're doing the opposite. I mean, I want to just say something here about negotiations, because I feel here particularly ashamed and angry with my own government, the British government. Because as we know, Zelensky's people, his negotiators, went to Istanbul and they came up with this proposal, and it was pretty half-cocked. There were lots of stupid things in it and all kinds of contradictions. But it did seem to start to move towards a realistic settlement of the war. I mean, Ukraine wouldn't join NATO. There'd be restrictions on on foreign troops on Ukrainian territory. Security guarantees would not cover Crimea and Donbass, probably paving the way for Ukraine to recognize the loss of Crimea and Donbass. And what happened? Boris Johnson and the British government contacted Zelensky. They said, we don't like what you've conceded. If you make these concessions, we are not going to give you security guarantees, the kind of security guarantees that you're seeking, and which are essential for you to pacify your hardliners in Kiev. We're absolutely not going to do that. They've got to encompass all of Ukraine, including Crimea and Donbass. In other words, you've got to retain your insistence that these territories are Ukrainian. And of course, if we're giving you security guarantees for Crimea and Donbass, that means in effect that we're prepared to help you recover those. And we're going to give you piles and piles of weapons so that you can go on and win the war. And what happened was, under that kind of pressure and with those sorts of promises and bribes, and of course, this is just the British, but the British played a leading role here, but the Americans as well. Zelensky did a 180-degree U-turn, and the result is that the war, the negotiations, which could have started after Istanbul and headed towards some kind of a solution, are now completely stopped. And as you rightly say, Ukraine is caught in a war of attrition, which it is losing disastrously. And can I just say, Gonzalo, I mean, you published this tweet that I saw a couple of days ago. I'm sure it was you. I mean, in which you said that, you know, there was this day, which was an absolutely disastrous day for Ukraine. There was the fiasco in Snake Island, which I'll come to in a moment. There was this loss of Popasnaya, which, you know, the Western media doesn't like to talk about. There's the encirclement of the troops in Severodonetsk. Yep. All this is very bad. But every day we get these reports of hundreds of men dying on the field of battle. And they're looking older, they're looking more ragged, they're becoming more tired. We see protests now, scattered small protests across Ukraine, but they will start to grow. And Ukraine is bleeding, and it's bleeding to death because of the arrogance and stupidity of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Ben Wallace, the Biden administration, Ursula von der Leyen, and all the others. So we've got a crisis, an economic crisis, an economic war of attrition, which is destroying the European economy, and an actual war of attrition, which is destroying Ukraine. I just want to mention Snake Island, because we all know what happened on Snake Island. But this morning, or I think it was last night actually, the British Ministry of Defense published its own account. And Snake Island was a great Ukrainian victory, in case you didn't know. What actually happened was that the Russians were going to try to resupply their garrison on Snake Island, and they were intending to transform Snake Island into some sort of fortress, and there were going to be cruise missiles there, and there was going to be all sorts of huge anti-aircraft missile systems there, and the Russians are having problems resupplying Snake Island, and these Bayraktar drones are knocking out the supply ships. You know, this is days after the actual battle. That's the story the British are being told about what actually happened on Snake Island.
Alex?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
Alex?
Yeah, no, you cut out for a second. Yeah, they're not talking. Yeah, they're rephrasing. Alex, I think that there's feedback on your end. There we go. Thank you, Alex. Alexander, the delusion over Snake Island is extraordinary. It's all over the place, all over social media. All kinds of nonsense is being pushed. Yeah. And what the disaster, of course, is that the whole Snake Island thing, from what I'm understanding, and this is not confirmed. I mean, none of this stuff is really confirmed, but there's enough evidence that it seems to be the case, that this nonsensical operation was pushed by the Boris Johnson government. Yeah. And it was Zelensky himself who gave the order to do this. Yeah. And there are rumors that a U.S. Marine commander and a British officer were lost in this particular escapade. And the whole point of it was to score a PR victory for May 9th, to spoil Victory Day. And what happened was, it didn't spoil Victory Day. It led to the death of 60 men for nothing. Because on top of that, Snake Island it's of trivial importance. It's an island in the middle of nowhere. I had no idea where it was. When I finally Googled it, I'm like, this place? It's in the middle of nowhere. Okay, it's not in front of Odessa or anything. I mean, technically yes, but it's 120 kilometers away. It's of no use. And they threw away 60 men, trained men, hard fighters, men that you cannot replace overnight. And I mean, you can't replace anybody, period.
No.
But in terms of an army, these experienced fighters were killed for no purpose whatsoever. It's just a tragedy. I mean, I just, they are so obsessed with PR, with how things look, as opposed to reality. That's the thing that I find so unconscionable about this entire situation, insofar as the war and how it is being conducted by the Zelensky regime and their minders in Ten Downing and the White House. All of these people are so obsessed with image, with the headline, with the narrative, with how things look, rather than the reality of the situation. It seems like they cannot confront reality. They can only live in some sort of weird fantasy land of narrative, of, you know, who can blow the biggest bubble of bullshit. That's all they seem to understand. It's an insanity. It's a sickness of the mind and of the soul, as far as I'm concerned. And look at reality.
Well, it's also a function, I have to say this, of our educational systems and the spread of postmodernism and the belief in narratives as being the dominant form of discourse, and of the belief that narratives can actually shape outcomes, which to some extent, of course, they can do, but only to some extent. I mean, you know, facts have a way of, in the end, of breaking through, but they don't understand wars of attrition. And they don't understand either that, as we have discussed so often on these programs, all three of us, in a war of attrition, which is the kind of war, as you rightly say, that the Russians like to fight. Now, you know, I'm not somebody who knows much about war and has been very interested in war, but I've been rereading, or at least reading, books about previous wars that the Russians have fought. And it is very much the Russian style, actually, to fight wars of attrition. I mean, they did that. That's how they defeated Napoleon, ultimately, for example. That's how they defeated the Germans in the Second World War. It is ultimately attrition that they do. That's what they are good at. Anyway, in a war of attrition, it's not whether you own this inch of ground or that inch of ground, whether you're advancing a kilometer here or a kilometer there. The purpose always is to destroy your enemy, to destroy your enemy's army. I mean, you know, Kutuzov gave up Moscow, but he destroyed Napoleon's army, and that brought the Russians all the way to Paris. So, I mean, this is what the Russians do. Now, what we're seeing in Ukraine is a particular form of this, because, of course, the Russians know what they're about, but we don't. I mean, we create stories about this Battle of Snake Island, which, I mean, I hadn't tell you the whole story about this. I mean, there were other suggestions that the Russians were going to install S-400 missiles on Snake Island. I mean,
it's not
quite apart from, well, I mean, quite apart from anything else. I mean, the size of the place, it's tiny. I mean, you can't realistically install vast numbers of missiles there. I mean, how do you reload the launchers? I mean, you can't. I mean, it can't be done. I mean, you know, this is a complete nonsense.
Yeah, you make it a big fat target. If it's that tiny, it's easy to just turn the whole thing into a fire zone, and that's that. You know,
exactly.
It's ridiculous. And you see, the thing I'm very concerned about at this stage, and I'll just throw it out there. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence that Ukrainian commanders are fleeing the field. Ukrainian officers are leaving their men. And there are so many anecdotes that, well, that old saying that, enough anecdotes and you're talking about data,
Yeah.
And there seems to be accumulating data, let's call it that, from the Russian POWs, the Ukrainian POWs, who are reporting to their Russian captors that their officers fled. And that's why they surrendered, because they didn't know what to do, because they didn't have the leadership. They were willing to continue to fight even. But if their officer isn't there, who do they shoot? Where do they go? They didn't know. So they gave up. And like you said before, a lot of these men are showing their age. They're not young men. They are older men, which means that the pool of available soldiers is rapidly diminishing for the Ukrainian armed force. But quite apart from that, you have to keep in mind that, and I'm speaking to chat so that you all know, deserting, an officer deserting his post during a war is a capital offense. If you're caught, you are court-martialed on the spot and often executed on the spot. It's the worst dereliction of duty that you can possibly carry out. And I am not saying this to cast aspersions on the officer class of the Ukrainian armed force. But what I am saying is that when officers get to that level of desperation, that they think that it is actually smarter for them to desert, run away, go to their families and try to escape with their families. Well, it signals that those officers no longer believe that any sort of victory can be achieved. They're basically signaling that the war is lost.
Yes.
And the more such incidents, the worse it gets, because the word gets around. The only thing that talks more than teenage girls are soldiers on the battlefield, because they've got nothing better to do. And so, they are going to talk, and because of communications technology, it's easy for them to communicate with their families, with other men in other units and whatnot, and tell them, hey, my lieutenant, my captain, my whatever disappeared. He, picked up one of the civilian cars, because all of our military vehicles have been destroyed. He picked up one of the civilian cars we were using, and he's gone. And everybody's going to know what happened, that he just took off. And this is going to demoralize that other unit. And so, this demoralization, see, on the one hand, it's tragic, but on the other hand, it will prevent a needless loss of life if people start to lose confidence in this war, because all of this propaganda that we talk about, the narrative and all this bullshit, because there's no other way to call it. That's what it is. Well, because of it, it leads people to continue to fight when they should know better, when they should realize, the cause is lost. It cannot be won. There's no way to win this war. And so these desertions, which are causing men to surrender, if there are more of them, it might bring an end to this war more quickly and saving more lives, because as far as I'm concerned, that's the priority, to save as many lives as possible. If there was a realistic chance of winning, I would say, fight with all you have, but there is no possibility to win. The war has been lost already. And at this point, it's just a mopping up operation, and it's a political fight between the Russians and the West, because the West isn't ever going to put in any troops. If they were going to put NATO troops on the ground to assist the Ukrainians, they would have done so already. And so that's not going to happen. And I have come to the conclusion just over the last couple of days that the NATO, no matter what the provocation, no matter what happens, they will never put NATO troops firing on Russian positions. They will never do so. I think that they have made up their minds in whatever halls of the Pentagon or wherever, that they are not going to get into this fight no matter what. And so therefore, the Ukrainian army is going to be demolished, all these young men killed for nothing. I'm sorry for going on a rant, but
no. Can I say it is also a particularly hideous death? Now, I am just old enough to have overlapped with the generation that fought the First World War. And remember, I came to Britain in the 60s, and there were still, quite a lot of people who fought through the First World War, and who tell me what the experience of prolonged artillery barrages is like. And I mean, it's apparently unimaginable There is nothing like it. I mean, people have told me that, because they've also experienced air raids and things during the Second World War. My grandfather fought in both the First and the Second World War. There is nothing to compare with an artillery barrage. That it can absolutely break you mentally in a way that bombing raid perhaps doesn't. So just to say that. But I'm very encouraged to hear you say, Gonzalo, that you don't think that NATO will send troops into Ukraine, because I mean, the rumors, the words out there is that they might do. There's been lots of speculation about this.
Sure.
What makes you so sure that they won't?
They would have done so already.
Mm.
And now that the Russians have become battle hardened, and now that it's very clear to any serious military analyst that the Russians are grinding down the Ukrainian armed forces, and on top of that, now that they have definitively cut the communications lines between the west and the east of Ukraine in terms of railroads, and so the ability to move troops in is really not possible. Troops and weapons and tanks and all the rest of it is just, it's not really practical. That all of that leads me to conclude, that NATO is not going to go. And I think that the thing that really scares them is the air defenses and the fact that the Russian armed forces, the army itself, is so battle hardened, because you cannot underestimate the difference that you have between green troops and troops that have been battle hardened. And the Russians, over the past 75 days, they have rotated most of their combat troops, I would imagine, through this conflict. And as they rotated them, all of these men have gotten on the ground battle experience. They're not going to be freaked out or concerned. And I think that NATO would be very, very afraid, very frightened to put their green troops that rely so heavily on air power to deliver firepower, because that's the NATO doctrine. They use air power to deliver firepower, and then they bring in their troops, whereas the Russians, they use artillery, and they have air defenses to limit that air power. If the Russian air defenses are as good as they appear to have been so far, then NATO's ability to deliver firepower on any given position is severely constrained, if not limited, and that would mean that NATO troops would be annihilated by Russian artillery. I think that NATO commanders have realized we can't win this, even if we had the troops, because that's something else that people don't seem to realize. NATO does not have the troops, does not have the men to match the Russians. And so I just don't see it happening. Realistically, I don't see it happening. And perhaps I'm very wrong. I've been hideously wrong before. I thought there wasn't going to be a war. I didn't think that the Russians would actually invade, and here we are. So I could be radically wrong. But looking at the situation at this time, I just don't see it. If you guys want to poke holes in logic, I'm more than willing to listen, because I'm very curious as to what you think of this analysis.
I fervently hope you're right. All I will say is this. The war is now taking a very clear direction. I want to talk about the Kharkov offensive in a moment, by the way, but because it's a part of the world that you are close to. But I mean, it's the Western media is absolutely full of it. Certainly the British media is. But always to stress, the major battle, as we've been saying, all three of us, from the first day almost, has been in Donbass. And the Ukrainian army there is being obliterated. Now, can Western governments allow that to happen, given the position that they've taken and given the economic crisis that they've inflicted on their people? Can they afford to fail? And that's really what makes me incredibly nervous about this situation, because if it looks as if there's going to be a full-scale Ukrainian collapse, which I think over the next couple of weeks we're probably going to start to see, what do Western governments do? And I'm worried that some governments might be tempted to do some crazy things. I mean, we've already often talked about Poland, for example, but Britain, the way the British have been talking about, the might of their armed forces is just extremely. I'm very worried about it.
Yeah, I have some ideas, and I've thought about it a lot, and so here I'll float them by you. My thinking is that if there is a breakthrough on the part of the Russians, a breakthrough on the part of the Russians, what is a war of attrition? It's just slowly grinding down every day until your opposing army all of a sudden just gives up and collapses. And if you look through history, when an army collapses, it's not a staggered thing. It's not a slow going thing. It's all of a sudden it just collapses like a sandcastle collapsing. And so, or a house of cards, that would be a better analogy. And so once that happens, this is my suspicion. And this is, take it for what it's worth. It's some middle-aged guy in eastern Ukraine who doesn't know much of anything. And, the things that he does know, he knows very little of them. So take it for what it's worth. I think that the Poles, once the Ukrainian armed forces collapse, the Poles, who have been carrying out all kinds of weird exercises in their southeastern border, right on the border with Ukraine, they will enter Ukraine as a peacekeeping force. And they will certainly grab Lviv, which is right on the border, and they will try to get as much as possible. They will certainly get Ivano-Frankivsk and possibly Ternopil, maybe a little bit farther out, Rivne, but certainly those three cities. And they will establish a peacekeeping zone, okay? And call it some sort of safe haven or something of the sort. Because you have to keep in mind something else that's happening to the Poles that very few people are noticing. They have a huge humanitarian crisis on their hands. They've got millions of Ukrainians, unemployed, homeless Ukrainians in their country. And many of them, if not most of them, poor. They don't want them. Of course not, okay? They might look like Poles, and many of them ethnically are probably more Polish than Ukrainian or Russian, certainly, but they don't want them on their doorstep. And so if, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that all of a sudden there's a quote-unquote breakthrough by the Russian army and the Ukrainian forces sort of like start to collapse back onto Kiev, the Poles might take this opportunity to invade Western Ukraine, of course, calling it a peacekeeping mission, and of course, getting some sort of okay from Zelensky, who isn't going to be in any position to really object. And the Poles take over Western Ukraine up to a certain limit, and it becomes their protectorate where they can move all of their migrants eventually. I'm talking in a few months, but it becomes the way of a stalemate. The Russians have captured a big chunk of Ukraine. They'll take all of the east and all of the south. I think that what you will see if you're looking at a map, the Russians would take Kharkov, certainly Lugansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, Zaporozhye, all the south, including Odessa. Odessa would fall of its own accord. I doubt if there's going to be a battle there. And they would take as far north as Dnipropetrovsk. If you look at the map, it's Dnipro or Dnipropetrovsk. It has two names. It's right in the center of the city, of the country, rather. They take up to that. And as they are controlling that area, the Poles take the opportunity to take the West, which Vladimir Putin hinted at in his February 24th statement regarding the special military operation, and which Medvedev, the former president and head of the Security Council, or I forget the name of their Security Council, but you know what I'm talking about. He also made a statement alluding to the Poles wanting to take a bite out of Ukraine. And well, the point is that, see, if a NATO country like Poland takes a piece of Ukraine and calls it a protectorate, a peacekeeping mission or something like that, then it's sort of like, oh, we won because we protected Ukraine, and the Russian invaders are over there on the east and south, but we have the West. They'll sort of like gussy it up, come up with a narrative, a story of some sort of how NATO, or at least the Poles, actually won. Insane as it may sound, but we've seen all kinds of PR insanity coming from the West, so I wouldn't put it past them. And that's how this will off-ramp there will be this rump Ukraine that will initially be led by Zelensky, but the Russians will somehow figure out a way to control it so that it becomes neutral long term. And the Russians are going to keep the East and the South. They're going to keep it forever. They are going to make it a part of Russia. They're already arranging to do so with Kherson. And it's inevitable for the rest of the territories that they capture, including the Donbass. The whole thing is going to become a part of Russia, with a Russian flag and Russian administration, Russian government, and rubles and the whole shebang. And we will see that rump Ukraine that will be a neutral buffer zone with pretty much nothing, because it doesn't have any industry. It doesn't have much agriculture. It certainly doesn't have any mineral resources or any other resources locked in the ground. It's going to be poor, bankrupt buffer zone. And then you'll have Western Ukraine, which will become this Polish protectorate. At this time, this seems to me the most logical outcome for the situation that allows everyone to declare victory, that allows everyone to point at the other and say, see, he lost, and for Europe and Russia to go their separate ways. You see the model that I'm presenting. Now, you guys tell me what you think of that and whether it's right, wrong, interesting idea, or off the charts crazy. You tell me. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
It seems to me a perfectly plausible model. The one thing I would say is that for the moment, my understanding is that the Russians are opposing it. I mean, they've said that if the Poles enter Western Ukraine, then of course they're an enemy too. But, you know, Gonzalo, I'm not excluding it. I mean, it was something that Putin did suggest might happen right at the start of the war, back at when he made his speech, when he made his address to the people, the Russian people. I think it was on the 21st of February. So he did leave the door open for that scenario. But what you seem to be excluding, and this is really what concerns me, I mean, is that there will be no NATO-Russian direct battle, and that there's no possibility that Biden and Johnson and those sort of people will say enough's enough. You know, Putin's done some terrible things in Ukraine. We're going to impose a no-fly zone, send our troops in, liberate Ukraine from the Russians, do anything of that kind. You don't think there's any chance of that?
Well, I hope I'm right on this one, but no, at this time I don't think so. Even though there have been videos of M1 Abrams tanks in Poland being transported by train, and dozens of them, right?
Yeah.
But I just don't see it. There's something else too that people don't seem to realize. I have crossed Ukraine on a motorcycle. It took me 4 days on highways, you know, with nobody shooting at me, no anti-tank mines or anything on my road, right? It's a huge country. It's the size of Texas, but elongated. Okay. And so the notion that somebody could cross the border, an army could cross the border in Poland into Ukraine and waltz unimpeded across the entire country and get to the Donbass and engage with the Russians is absurd. It's just ridiculous because the Russians have these standoff missiles, you know, the fire and forget type missiles that would annihilate such a force. Yeah. And quite apart from the fact that, see, the transportation to move all that gear to the east no longer exists as a practical matter. I mean, the trains exist, but they're not functioning. There are a few diesel trains, but like I said, very few diesel trains. Most of them are electric. And the electrical substations that are necessary have been destroyed by the Russians systematically. So any kind of west-east transport is not going to happen. And so, you know, as a practical matter, the NATO could invade Ukraine today, but where would they go? The country is endless. And so they could invade. They would be sitting ducks for Russian missiles if the Russians decide to play nasty with them. And so I just don't see it. It doesn't make any kind of military sense. And the thing is, see, the losses would be so catastrophic for NATO that I don't think that any NATO commander would be willing to take those losses because he would
you'd have to be a complete idiot not to realize that he's going to take losses that are incalculable. Because there's something else too. The Russians have been going generally soft on Ukraine and the Ukrainian army. If it comes to an invasion by NATO out of the West, they're not going to care about Lviv. Lviv means nothing to them. They're going to wipe the whole place. And it will be because they know where they are. They know where the NATO commanders are in Lviv. Those are going to be the first places hit. They're going to hit the whole thing and just level it, crater it, turn it into a lunar landscape, you know? Because they do nothing to them. They're the enemy. So that's why I think that, I mean, I guess maybe perhaps in my tone, it betrays a bit of hopefulness on my part. Because if NATO were to invade, it would be a catastrophe.
Yeah.
If Poland were to invade, they would have to get the go-ahead from the Russians. And by the way, I have no doubt in my mind that the Poles and the Russians, for all the rhetoric coming out of Poland, they must have some back-channel communication. They must be in touch, because neither side is that stupid. And so if there is a Polish incursion, it would not be under the aegis of NATO. It would be as Poland, or perhaps allied to Lithuania. And it would be with a back channel okay from the Russians, because I think that everybody realizes how vulnerable they are. Remember that strike that happened at the NATO training center just outside of Lviv that happened in early March, I believe?
Yeah.
That put NATO on notice. Basically, the notice was, we can get you anywhere in Ukraine. Okay? And I think that that lesson was learned. And so, yeah, but that's what I'm hoping. So I could be wrong.
Can I just ask, let's just thank you for all of that, by the way, Gonzalo. That's very informative. But can I just ask you now, because it's your part of the world, what you make of the great Kharkov counteroffensive? Because if you go to the British media, this is the part of the war that they're absolutely talking most about, that, you know, that the Ukrainians are advancing, they're sweeping the Russians away from Kharkov, they're driving them away, they're driving them towards the Russian frontier, they're going to cut off the Russian supply lines. What do you make of the situation? After all, you're not far from this. Well, you are actually, but anyway, so tell me what you make of it.
I think two possibilities, okay? Okay, number one, I think it was a trivial offensive, okay, and it meant nothing, okay, because you have to keep in mind that, see, you push 40 kilometers north and you're in Russian territory, okay, and so, you know, pushing the Russians back into their own home court, because they're not even really bothering with Kharkov, they're going around it, okay, they're just going diagonally from the northwest direction to a southeast direction and pouring resources in that direction, and they have army units that are maintaining their line. And so the Ukraine offensive was basically pushing that line back, and the Russians obliged them, and they also took the opportunity to straighten out their line and just retreated, but it really didn't mean much to them one way or the other, because their flow of supplies, gear, gasoline, and all the rest of it was not interrupted by any stretch of the imagination. And there's also another possibility that should be explored. The Russians are keeping awfully quiet about it. They're not making a to-do about it, because other times they do. They say, oh, this happened, you know. They're not making a to-do about it. And frankly, I'm wondering if they're setting up the Ukrainians for an encirclement and a trap. You know, if they keep pushing forward in a northeasterly direction, which is what the Ukrainian forces are doing, I'm wondering if this force will find itself entrapped, encircled, entrapped, and then the Russian army will find it easy to just move forward, take out this pocket, and move forward and come even closer to Kharkov, or perhaps even encircle the city and cut it off definitively. You know, I am not sanguine about this situation. I think that the Ukrainians should be very careful, because, see, the Russians, you know, the Russians are good at war. Bottom line, okay, they're good at it. Okay, you know, the French are good at food and fashion and making love. The Italians are good at pasta. The Russians are good at war. It's as simple as that. And so when they, you know,
when they seem to be quote unquote retreating, I would be nervous, to tell you the truth, because the Russians, they're up to something. In Spanish we have a saying. Well, I'm not going to say the saying in Spanish. It's too complicated to translate, quite frankly. But they always have a plan. As Andrei Martyanov said when he was on the other day, the Russians don't go to the toilet without a plan. Yeah. And so if they're pulling back like that, I don't know. I'd be nervous if I were a Ukrainian commander. But that's me.
I'll just give my own tuppence worth, which is basically that, as you correctly say, I think this is trivial. As I understand it, the numbers of troops involved on both sides has been relatively small, actually very small relative to the overall battle. I don't think there has been a Ukrainian offensive as such. I think the Russians, now that Popasnaya has fallen and Severodonetsk and all these places have been encircled, they'd kept some troops close to Kharkiv as a kind of flanking force. They don't need them there anymore, so they pulled back, and the Ukrainians have advanced to occupy territory the Russians have vacated, and they're calling it an offensive. Now, I say that because a BBC journalist has been there, and the overwhelming impression I got was that there's actually been very, very little fighting in this part of the war. By the way, the possibility that the Russians are luring the Ukrainians into a trap, I think, is a very, very real one. Something very similar to that happened during the Donbass fighting back in 2014, as I well remember, that the Ukrainians were given pathways to advance, which ultimately turned into traps. And again, what I've been reading about Russian style of war, going again all the way back to Napoleon and all that, 1812, is that the Russians like to do this quite a lot. It's a sort of step, as in STEPPE. It's a kind of Mongol type style of fighting. That you appear to retreat, you then draw your enemy forward, and then you're able to sort of encompass him. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's what's happening. I don't know if that's the case. I don't want to speculate, but it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. But anyway, I don't think this episode has any of the significance that some people allege. And I think this is what it probably is doing, Gonzalo, is it's probably making life in Kharkiv a little calmer, maybe?
No, it's pretty much the same, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
The air raid sirens go off. I have to admit that the air raid sirens, I find them extremely annoying because they go off and it's all very dramatic. But, it's way after the shelling, and so like, why are you bothering, But, be that as it may. My sense of this, to put an end to this line, or to move on to another issue, it's more PR bullshit. Because we're talking about few soldiers, okay, in a relatively minor part of the overall war. I mean, not relatively minor; it is a minor part of the war. The major part is in the Donbass region. The Popasnaya was a huge victory.
Yes.
Yeah? It was major because all of a sudden the Russians have the highest ground where they can park all their artillery, and they can hit anything in a 30-kilometer radius. And if they put their really big guns, they can hit it at a 40-kilometer radius. And so all of a sudden they're owning the battlefield with their reconnaissance drones. They can put an artillery shell, within half a meter of where they're aiming for. Okay, you've turned a howitzer into a sniper rifle, and that's what they're doing by capturing Popasnaya. And this, of course, we are seeing it insofar as reports. Just before I came on, there were reports of more troops moving, pulling back, Ukrainian troops pulling back. The Popasnaya victory was a huge victory, and the PR machine of the Zelensky regime and of the West is trying to gussy up the quote unquote Kharkov offensive as if it mattered. It doesn't. It's just, like you said, they decided to pull back, and the Ukrainians moved forward, and that's a victory. They captured empty land and called it victory.
I completely, Gonzalo, I'm entirely in agreement with you. By the way, I've only been able to find one reference in the British media to the fall of Popasnaya, which was in a brief mention in an article in The Guardian about a Pentagon official claiming that the war in Donbass was in a state of stalemate. And if you really drill deep down, you discover that the Ukrainians withdrew from Popasna, as it's called by the British media, Popasna, over the weekend, full stop. And it then went on to say, well, Severodonetsk is about to be surrounded, but that's not really an important thing either, really.
They don't understand the notion of a war of attrition. That what happens is that it's not merely that you're grinding away and eating just a little bit of territory every day. It's that the territory you do capture, you're really holding it. It's not like in the initial phases of this war, when the Russian forces came in on their 6 different axes of attack, when they hit Kiev and Chernihiv and Sumy and Kharkov and Donbass and came out of Crimea, on those 6 axes, they were just racing ahead, leaving gear behind so as to move as far forward as possible. And all that land that they conquered, quote unquote, they didn't really hold it, okay? But now the land that they have, they're holding it. This is the kind of war that they understand, that they're good at. They're holding that land. And when you look at a map of Ukraine now, and you look at territory that the Russians have captured in the east and the south, it's not that they have passed through it. It's not that they have fire support on it. No, they own that land. It's theirs. And that's the difference with a war of attrition. And so the West, they don't seem to understand that these little incremental steps every day, they add up. And it's theirs. They won it. And nobody's going to take it away from them. And the notion that they're going to be taking away Mariupol or Kherson, it's laughable. I mean,
I agree.
Don't get high on your own supply, as the saying goes.
Let's just quickly, because we're almost up to our hard stop. Let's just hear what you think about Finland and Sweden, because this is a bizarre story, in my opinion. I mean, 2 countries utterly dedicated to neutrality, at least visibly so. Sweden has always, to my knowledge, been a quiet ally of the US. It's always had a long tradition of being antagonistic to Russia. That hasn't been true of Finland. The way these 2 countries have been roped in, they're not threatened. Their own governments admit that they're not threatened. So why are they doing it all of a sudden?
Because they're morons. Because they want to be part of the club. They are the anti-Putin club. Again, it's like teenage girls, for crying out loud. I mean, it's something that's acceptable with girls who are 13, but not with grown adults who have responsibilities. It's absurd. And so, look, the Swedes and the Finns, look, the Swedes don't really matter. It's the Finns that matter. We have to remember that the Finns and the Russians, back when it was the Soviet Union, they had a war. And the Finns assisted the Nazis in the siege of Leningrad, today St. Petersburg. And so, those ancient angers remain. Now, Finns and Soviets signed a treaty in 1948. And the treaty was that Finland would be neutral and would never again host any kind of foreign military on its soil. Of course, the fear of the Soviets at that time was that Finland might one day host American weapons, American nuclear weapons, American God knows what. Because remember, see, look at a map. Finland is right across the bay from St. Petersburg. And so it's vulnerable. I mean, that's why, how many millions of Soviet citizens died of starvation? 1 million, I think.
I've been to the cemetery, by the way.
Yeah, it's horrifying. Okay. And so the Russians, the Soviets, and the Finns signed this treaty in 1948 that guaranteed Finnish neutrality. And that treaty was rescinded in 92. It was renegotiated when, of course, Russia was on its back It had no strength. It had no power. And in the treaty, the neutrality remained, but there was no obstacle for the Finns to join at that time, the European Community, now the European Union. And so it was left at that. And this treaty, as I understand it, from '92 lasted, I do believe, 10 years, and was going to be recycled. It would be re-upped every 5 years. And as far as I know, the reading I did before this broadcast, I don't think that there's been any change. But the point is, see, Finland has always been neutral because it has understood that St. Petersburg, the second most important city in Russia, is extraordinarily vulnerable to Finland. And so it's in Finland's best interest to always remain neutral, because if it allies with anybody, it becomes an instant provocation for Russia. Not just merely a provocation, it becomes, again, existential. And so my thinking is that the Russians are not bluffing when they tell the Finns, don't do that. And insane as it may sound, you might find that the Russians invade Finland. Now, there's a whole bunch of problems going on with Finland, because first of all, Finland and Russia have enormous trade between them. For obvious reasons, they're right next door to one another. And the Finns have a generally good relationship with the Russians. Okay? That's one thing. Number two, historically, Finland has always been a part of the Russian Empire. It was only after the First World War that Finland had this separate autonomous and became a separate autonomous state. But before that, it was always a part of Imperial Russia. And the third problem is that, see, the Finns do not have the army to resist the Russians, not even close. And nobody could save their bacon. If the Russians decide we're going to take over Finland, it would be about a half hour. It would be much easier than Ukraine, because Ukraine is big. You look at Finland and it only seems big, but if you look at Finland on like an actual globe, you realize how tiny it is, because it really is. It's only because of the Mercator projection that it looks big, but it's like Greenland. Greenland looks enormous, bigger than Africa, and then you actually see it and it's just like Madagascar or something, right? And so the point is that Finland would be rolled up in a couple of days, especially now after the Russians now have a battle-hardened army that knows exactly what it's doing. They could roll it up very, very quickly. I think that the Finns are playing with fire. I think that they're fools. And the Finnish prime minister, who again is another puppet, I forget her name. She's a very attractive young woman. She's like 36, I believe. Extremely attractive. She's a moron. I mean, she's a complete imbecile, and she's really just a puppet, no different than Justin Trudeau or Zelensky or any of these other puppet presidents, puppet leaders that we have, because they're all just puppets of hidden powers. They're not the actual leaders of their country. They're only positioned there because they play well on the PR front. Well, this woman is a fool, and she is playing with fire. And the people who are puppeteering her somehow have this notion that Finland can fight the Russians. They actually think that Finland is the same as it was back in 1939 when the Finns and the Soviets went to war. The situation today is radically different. That was 80 years ago, more than 80 years ago. Today, Finland does not have the army. They would be rolled up instantly. They wouldn't last an hour against a serious Russian onslaught. And people also, there's something else that to finish the point. In this war with Ukraine, people don't understand and don't want to understand or accept the fact that the Russians, they came in very soft. They tiptoed into Ukraine. They didn't want to hurt the country. They wanted to keep their options open. They wanted to put political pressure for negotiations. They didn't want to be destroying Ukraine, because the Russians view Ukraine as a brother nation. They have no such feelings about Finland. And insofar as Finland is concerned, they view it historically as an ally of the Nazis. So if they were to invade Finland, it would be scorched earth. It would be annihilation. I think that the Finns are fools. And the Swedes, they don't matter anymore. They are a broken people who are being invaded by Middle Easterners and Africans, and they're being annihilated in their own country. They mean nothing. Quite frankly, they're pathetic. The Swedish Empire died in Poltava in the 17th century. What remains today is nothing in comparison. You know what I mean?
Shall we stop there? I think you said that you had a hard stop, Alex. Is that right?
Yeah. Let's end it there.
Let's end it there. Can I just thank you for a tour de force again, Gonzalo? By the way, I should quickly say I know Finland well. I've been there. I've stayed in Helsinki. Helsinki feels like a suburb of St. Petersburg. The entire population of Finland is smaller than that of St. Petersburg. If you know the real feelings about the place, I'd have thought that Finland is at more danger now than it's ever been. And the idea that Finland can be a threat to St. Petersburg or Russia, even with the support of NATO, it seems to me a fanciful one. That's all I'm going to quickly say. A tour de force, Gonzalo. Thank you again for your tremendous contributions and insight. And I agree. It's one of the apart from, I'm still a bit more nervous about a NATO intervention force in Ukraine than you are. Sure. But in all other respects, I mean, it's interesting to find how much we agree, actually. Well, and on the economics, we're a complete.
On the NATO issue, part of it, I'll admit, is wishful thinking on my part, because I recognize that if NATO gets involved, all bets are off. It would be horrifying. And so perhaps on my part, I'm indulging in wishful thinking. So
we'll see. Well, I hope your wishful thinking turns out to be the correct thinking. For the rest, I mean, we're basically on all fours. The economics was a masterly discussion, and about the actual war itself, I think you're spot on right. So I think just to say thank you again.
Great minds think alike, Alexander. It's always a pleasure. And Alex, I hope that things work out with whatever problems you're having, because it's no fun at all to see you there down in the dumps, and so
he's not got problems. He's not got problems. He's struggling with the results of success.
That's
we'll leave it to there, guys. We'll leave it there, guys. Thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you very much for another great stream. Thank you to everyone on Rumble, on Odyssey, on YouTube, as well as our great chat on Locals, the Duran.locals.com. Gonzalo, I will put all your information for Twitter and for your second YouTube channel. I will put that as a pinned comment down below. Some people are asking.
Before I go, I just want to say, chat, thanks so much. I hope you guys in the chat enjoyed the show, and to the moderators, as always, thank you so much. And because I love chat. I love watching what everybody's saying while we're streaming. So thank you so much, chat.
And some people were saying that Gonzalo has a Telegram channel. From what I understand, Gonzalo, you do not have an active Telegram channel.
No, I don't have an active Telegram channel. I haven't been able to post since April 15th. So anyone who says that they have that there's a Gonzalo Lira Telegram channel now, that's a fake. Just so that you all know.
Okay, great. So the official channels, Twitter and YouTube, will be posted as pinned comments. Thank you to our moderators, Zariel, Valley S, GEC 810, Reckless Abandon, Alan Watson, and who else was moderating today? I think I got everybody. I think so. If I missed somebody, I apologize, but I think I got all the moderators as well. Thank you very much to our moderators, as always. We appreciate everything that you do. So we'll end it there, everybody, and have a great day.